Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Toby Graham, Associate Provost and University Librarian, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to UGA Special Collections Libraries. Tonight, we celebrate Pat Mitchell and the release of her new book, Becoming a Dangerous Woman. We're happy to be joined by Pat's husband, Scott Seidel, and is Laura here as well this evening? And so thanks to all of our other UGA leaders who are with us this evening. We've got Jeff Jones and Shauna are here. He's the director of the Peabody Awards. Meredith Johnson is here. Where's Meredith? Our director of alumni relations. And it is delightful too, when I looked at the RSVP list to see how many supporters of the library are here this evening. So if you're a member of our Board of Visitors for the library or the Advisory Council for the UGA Press or for the Georgia Review, if you could just stand for me just for a moment, and Les, thank you for the support that you provide. And I just want to recognize too, I saw Coleman Barks come in. Where is
there he is, up at the back.
Coleman, I'm sure a lot of you know who Coleman Barks is, a renowned poet and inductee into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame, and thank you for being with us tonight as well. And in particular, I want to thank Tom Johnson as we ask him to introduce Pat, because few have been able to observe both the accomplishments and the work that were put into them from quite the same perspective that Tom Johnson has. Tom and Pat, you all met here during your time at UGA.
Yes.
Not long ago, just recently. Yes. Tom later attended Harvard Business School. He became press aide and longtime key confidant of President Lyndon Johnson, and subsequently was publisher of the Los Angeles Times, and then became CNN president, where he and Pat also worked together. Tom retired from CNN in 2001, and since has done a number of worthy things, including chairing the board for the Lyndon B. Johnson Foundation. That's a short list for what ought to be a long biography for Tom.
That is really short.
However, being a good librarian, I will give you a point of reference for more information. So in 2010, the University of Georgia conducted an interview with Tom about his life and his career, his work, his time at UGA, and that is available online. So if you Google that, you can find out much more about him, and I'm sure we'll learn a little bit more about that tonight. So it's our pleasure to welcome you to the podium, Tom Johnson.
Thank you. I thank you very much for that introduction. I did not deserve it, but my wife, Edwina, my wife of 55 mostly happy years, says that I do not deserve her either. Unfortunately, she couldn't attend tonight. In the almost 60 years that I've known Pat, I have either delivered or listened to many conventional introductions of her. Tonight is not the night. I want you to know Pat Mitchell as I have unconventionally for all of these years. When I was a leader of the academically challenged Sigma Nu fraternity here, we elected Patsy Edenfield of Swainsboro, Georgia, as our sweetheart. She was elected unanimously for this position, and here's why. These were the qualities that we, the brothers of Sigma Nu, love most about her. She was, and she still is, a spectacular dancer. She was, and she still is, beautiful. She was, and still is, brilliant. But what made her extraordinarily popular with us was that she could write, and she still can. With deadlines looming, Pat would assist us in writing our class papers. Enough time has now passed, I hope, that I can confirm that many of the very best papers that were turned in under the names of my fraternity brothers were actually written entirely by Pat. Now, do keep in mind, this was before women's lib. This was before the Me Too movement. This was before women's rights. Even now, some men, perhaps even some in this room, call that the good old days. That was before Pat had become a dangerous woman, as she now is. She was not content only to be the beauty queen in the Swainsboro Pine Tree Festival, although she did develop a strong urge to be in the parade. She has either been in or she has been at the front of as the leader of the parades ever since. Earning straight A's in class, becoming at one point the best actress in the state, even giving occasional sermons, imagine that. She developed a dramatic flair, a flare that had ignited into a lifetime bright flame, which nothing over all these years can extinguish. It still burns brightly, perhaps even brighter than ever. A scholarship in drama brought Pat to the university. On this campus, she flourished. However, an unexpected visit by her father to see his daughter dressed scantily in a play in a role of a prostitute led him to ordering her, and I think I quote, "You are coming home." However, Pat remained at Georgia. She fell in love with teaching, which she still loves. She by then had already begun to become a dangerous woman. College, an unplanned pregnancy, a son, a divorce from one of my best fraternity brothers, travel. She fell in love with travel then, as she does now. She discovered also the addictive qualities of television as a popular theater critic at WBZ in Boston, where Dr. John Solaski first heard of her and reminded me of that tonight. She also discovered that discrimination in pay existed between the compensation of men and women. Unfortunately, it still does. However, by then, she was well on her way, well on her journey to believe in her own values. Yes, I can sprang from yes, we can, that movement. As her splendid book reveals, she found it very difficult to balance the role of mother with her professional responsibilities. For a while, she felt she was a failure as mother to her son, Mark. And she admits she pursued jobs at times at the expense of some solid relationships. But in her career, she has had so many historic successes. Woman to Woman on NBC's Today Show became a major hit. She changed the lives of women from watching daytime soaps to shows that really made a substantive difference in women's lives. She discovered her talent for documentary filmmaking on trips to Israel and El Salvador, where she and her companion, a producer, were almost killed by a bomb exploding quite nearby. On her travels to Cuba, she became friends with Fidel Castro and even recorded Fidel admitting that at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the nuclear missiles that he possessed in Cuba were, quote, armed and ready to go. Fidel told Pat that he had even asked Soviet leader Khrushchev for permission to launch those missiles at the United States, but fortunately for all of us and for the world, Khrushchev said no. Pat's interview with Castro never received the global attention that it deserved. Working with Ted Turner at CNN and TBS, and with Robert Redford at Sundance, Pat found two new close friends who also engaged as she has with life with great passion and great purpose. Inspired by Ted, and in fact, funded by Ted out of my budget, Pat's documentary on the Cold War remains the most comprehensive documentary on that 40 years of global history ever produced. Pat's life has been a series of other spectacular achievements, yet fame has never spoiled this girl. She has never forgotten those who inspired and nurtured her at the beginning, her mother, her grandmother, her high school teacher, Mrs. Roundtree, her UGA advisor, Dr. Boyd McWhirter, her lifetime best friend, Glenda Grimsley, who is here with us tonight. You will hear from Pat about the more recent years, including the influence of Charlene Hunter Galt, Eve Ensler, Oprah Winfrey, Jane Fonda, Glenn Close, and especially Scott Seidel, the man of her dreams, who today is her adoring husband. The pretty Patsy Edenfield of Swainsboro, became the powerful Pat Mitchell, who has made our world, especially the world of women, far better than she found it. So dangerous men and dangerous women, please welcome Pat Mitchell.
I hope someone recorded that so that when I pass, it can just be reread at my memorial service. Tom, that was so wonderful and so characteristic of you to not only take this opportunity to say wonderful things about our long-term friendship, but to read the book with the kind of attention and commitment that you can tell he has done. In fact, he's probably relieved you all of the responsibility by the opportunity of reading it. He's marked it with hundreds of questions that he wants to ask. Is it not on? And I'm having a little bit of a voice issue from the 20-something book event so far, but none as anticipated. Is that better? Oh, I can tell. You want me to repeat all that? No? I just thank this fabulous man for an incredible interview and the fact that he read my book so well, he probably took care of the reading for the rest of you. I hope not. There are many stories in the book, and I just wanted to share a little bit of the book itself before Tom and I have a conversation, because I found that in the 5 years it took me to write this book, that I faced a couple of barriers and then saw a couple of opportunities. And I share them because in this audience, there are teachers who inspire others to write. There are people who recognize great writing, and then there are great writers like Coleman Barks, who is among us. Wonderful to see you, Coleman. That I had to overcome first the barrier that did my life story have any relevance or resonance for today's women and men. And I found in writing and recalling the stories of my life's journey that, in fact, many of the challenges that I faced all along the way were still being faced, particularly by young women, and not just young women. And so there was value and need to share those stories as encouragement, as inspiration to continue. And then secondly, I had this revelation that it's not a revelation because anyone who's alive today knows this to be a fact. We are living in dangerous times. And the more I thought about my own struggle to be a part of that, to making the world a better place for our children and grandchildren, and worried about that, the more I felt the book could also be a call to action. So it is both a memoir of my stories, but at the end of each of my stories, there's an interview with another dangerous woman whose life and whose work has inspired me. Stacey Abrams, Christiane Amanpour, the first woman president of Ireland, a woman who works with survivors of sexual violence in the Congo, quite a large group of women, and what they say about why it's time to become dangerous and what that means in our life and work was all the more inspiring to me and I hope will be to you as well. So the first question I'm asked about the book is, okay, why this title? So I'll just, rather than read the prologue, which tells the whole story, I'll just explain briefly that I was sitting in a room somewhat like this, only in a circle, with a lot of very impressive people, leaders of organizations, activists, many people with the credentials that are represented here. And everyone was standing up and doing that thing you're always asked to do, which is describe who you are in one or two words. And everybody I know struggles with how to do that, to make sense of our whole life in one title. Well, I didn't have a title. For the first time in my working life, I didn't have a title. So I began to get more and more anxious about how I was going to introduce myself to this group. And when it came my turn, after a lot of apprehension, I heard myself stand up and say, I'm Pat Mitchell and I'm a dangerous woman. I honestly do not know where it came from at that moment, but I could tell by looking at the faces around the room that I probably needed to add a little bit more context. So I went on to say that, well, I'm 76 years old. I have much less to lose. I have nothing left to prove. And I am damned impatient about everything, especially about the rights and the struggles that I have spent my life fighting for, to see them being rolled back and pushed back by rising racism, sexism, and nationalism all over the world. So that's how it began. Declaring myself a dangerous woman still feels, well, dangerous. And I readily admit to second thoughts about putting it as the bold title widely on this book. But every day since that convening, I'm discovering more about what being dangerous means in my life and why I believe it's time for us, women and the men and the allies who stand with us, at whatever age or place we are in life's journey, to embrace more risk, to engage with renewed passion and collective purpose for the truly dangerous work of making the world a safer and more sustainable place for women, girls, and families. I've had to face those questions and those of others about how do I define dangerous in this work? Well, for me, it doesn't mean being feared, but it does mean being fearless. It does mean speaking the truth when silence is a lot safer. Showing up for one another, even within the patriarchal construct that encourages us, especially as women, to compare and compete. And it does mean speaking out against the policies and the politics that divide us and diminish our individual power. It also means using every opportunity, every sphere of influence, every platform, every moment of privilege to bring forward the ideas and values that unite us. And it means for me sharing our stories as generations of women have done throughout the ages to survive, thrive, and move forward. So that's why I'm sharing my journey now, from small-town South Georgia girl with big dreams, but no means to realize them, no money, no connections, no power, no sphere of influence, to media executive with influence, and yes, to where I am today. More prepared to use my privilege, platforms, and every opportunity and every connection to optimize, to elevate other women and their stories, to support their struggles, and celebrate their accomplishments. I know Tom wants to talk about my grandmother, but I'll just share one paragraph about my early years. My story began in a very unlikely place, on my grandparents' small cotton farm with no indoor plumbing or electricity. But what I had in those days was a grandmother who could wring a chicken's neck with one arm and pump water with the other, while telling me fanciful stories of places she had never seen. Stories that ignited an intense curiosity that really is at the heart of everything I have done in my life and work. By taking some early risk and leaps of faith in myself, I escaped the limitations of resources and pushed back barriers, sometimes helping to dismantle them, while often coping with the challenges of being the first or the only woman. And very early on, I learned the value of nurturing connections, of building and sustaining a network of friends and colleagues, and of being an advocate for other women in every room and every opportunity. So now I'm ready to join that global community of women and our allies, stepping into our power and redefining it by how we use it and share it. Because it's time, prime time, for all the good we can do, being dangerous together. Thank you. Thank you.
Pat, in your book, when talking about Swainsboro, you write, "I did not belong there." Explain why.
Well, this was a small town in South Georgia. It still is a small town in South Georgia. Same population, actually, than when I lived there. That was in the segregated South that bought into a value system that didn't feel right to me. And from the beginning, I felt a story that I've shared that I bet others have felt in this room, that the stork must have gotten lost in bad weather because there's sort of wouldn't have been born there. It just didn't fit, Tom, with what I wanted for my life and what my grandmother had inspired me early to believe was possible.
In another section of your book, you write, "I had a strong urge to be in the parade. Being the beauty queen riding on the float in the Pine Tree Festival was not enough. When did you finally feel you not only were in the parade, but that you were leading the parade?"
Well, you know, parades became important if you lived in small towns in Georgia because they were the only thing that ever happened every year, right? I mean, the only colorful, exciting moment where it looked like something was actually going beyond the city limits. So I loved the Pine Tree Festival parade and every other one that came through town. But, you know, it was only 10 blocks after all, and it didn't actually leave the city limits. When I first felt that I was leading a parade, that was a long time, Tom, because leaving the South was a big moment. Getting a divorce, moving outside the wonderful, secure life that I enjoyed here as a student, a graduate student, and as a faculty member, but deciding to make the decision to take my big city journalism dreams and go to New York, and then going through all of the challenges that we all did as pioneers in the television business then. I never felt like I was leading a parade. I felt like I was trying to stay in the parade and you know, doing as a lot of us did, following bad instructions, bad advice, conflicting advice. But the one thing that I decided to do, which was controversial and but set me on my path, was that everybody told us, do not do women's stories, stay far away from women's ideas and promoting women. And by the way, protect your own turf because there's only room for one of you, so don't become friends or allies. Well, that was a really tough way to be. And once inside television, I thought, this is unbelievable power. We put something on the air at 6 o'clock and 7 million people are watching it that night. I mean, the ability to influence the way people thought our ideas or start debates, and it was irresistible. So I decided to use it for women and started pushing to do more programming about women. And out of that, made the first big career risk, which was leaving the network and setting up my own company to do only programming for women. And that was in the mid-'80s when nobody was doing that. And I think then, when I went into that office every day and there were 85 women working together, and there were babies, by the way, because we had on-site daycare even in 1984. And changing diapers will definitely keep your perspective where it should be. I think that was the first time that I felt like I was leading a parade that mattered.
There are many women in this audience, including several younger women, who are thinking about they would like to be in the parade or lead the parade just like Pat Mitchell. What advice do you have for them?
Believe in yourself, and don't, I always say my favorite advice is Eleanor Roosevelt, so I'll quote her, because somebody gave this to me early on, Mrs. Roundtree, who you mentioned. She said, never let anybody tell you no unless they have the power to also tell you yes. And that is a really good filter. If you can filter somebody saying, no, 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 you can't, you're not qualified. If you start to believe, does that person have the ability to also say yes to me? And if you said yes to yourself and believe that you are, step up, be there, show up, and show up for each other.
I always mention the importance of adopting mentors.
Absolutely.
And you had mentors. And as I look out
Women
in
and
the room,
men.
it's so important, I think, that if you don't have a mentor, that you go and find one or two. And tell us about your mentors.
Well, I have a chapter in the book for both mentors and mentees, because I think it's such an important relationship. And I did not ever get to work for a woman. There were no women executives in the media business. In fact, there are still very few. So I mostly worked for men, and I was lucky to work for some alpha males who taught me a lot about leadership. But I always looked for and identified friends and allies. And they were, in their own way, all of them, a network of mentors. My 8th grade English teacher, absolutely, she got me here to the university. Here I had Dr. McCord, as you mentioned, who really helped me keep my balance during a very transformative time at this university. We had just desegregated, the civil rights marches were going on, the women's marches were, we came of age during 2 great social justice movements, and that had everything to do with the way I felt. So I got lucky in those early years. If you haven't found one yet, to the young women in the room, choose a mentor not because you want to be her, because that's always the wrong reason. Choose one who has something to share and teach you that will be of value to whatever particular path you're taking. And then I give some advice about the expectations, because you have to set boundaries, both with mentees and for mentees.
And you write about unwanted sexual advances that took place along the way. How do you advise young women and young men? How do you handle them?
Well, I advise every one of us to speak up now, and I wish we had spoken up earlier. And I think had we been more truthful, more trusting of each other in those early days, the women who were working together in companies, in particular media companies, although we know sexual harassment and abuse of power, which is really what it is everywhere and still rampant. But had we spoken up then, had we been more courageous, had we been willing to risk losing our jobs, which was very possible, I did reject an advance, which ended up with my losing a contract, and that's minor compared to what many, many women around me lost. So I decided to just mention one example in the book because I knew it was happening to every other woman, and they knew it. But none of us ever shared it with each other. And because we didn't go public, with the exception of a few brave women in the late 70s who did and who lost their careers completely in television. I think we might have prevented some of the 17 million Me Too stories that went on the Me Too platform in the first month. 17 million. in the first month. And you know how many people have been in any way met consequences? Less than 200. So look at that. That says everything. It's a huge problem, and we won't fix it until everyone is willing to be open with the secrets, to trust each other, and to create an environment where women and men are safe.
Your friend Jeff Greenfield told you, and I quote, "Television will ruin your life." Why did you ignore his advice?
Well, my father was the first to tell me that. My father sold television sets in the early 50s. We were the only family that didn't have one. And when I would ask him, I don't understand. All the neighbors have these new fancy wood television. Remember when they were in cabinets? And he would say, "Oh no, television is an evil influence." And so later, when I went into television, he had a lot of comments about that. But Jeff was wrong because television ended up making his life, after all. He went on to become a huge television star. He was just trying to talk me into staying where I was. And I was following my curiosity.
A major theme in your book is the difficulty that you experienced in being a mother and a professional career woman. What advice do you have to those in this audience, both men and women? What advice in terms of trying to balance it?
This is one area where I am very reluctant to give advice, because had I been better at that balancing act, or had I had better models or known more, then I'd feel more qualified to give advice. But I will share this because I believe it's possible. Find a partner, a life partner, who will co-parent, who will be there to support. Also helps if he loves to do housework. Well, certainly in my case, it does. And cook, neither one of which I am any good at all. But I didn't meet my partner until I was in my mid-50s. And I had already given up on finding somebody with whom I could share my life. My son was already on his own, and he had survived me. And we had survived each other. We grew up together, and, it was tough being a single woman raising a child in those days. It's still tough, by the way. I don't know why we say in those days. But just when I gave up, Scott Seidel walked in the door, and here's a man who raised 5 children while running an international business. So it can be done. If I had just met him and learned a few more lessons from him, or observed him a little more closely, or people like him, women and men, or my friend Glenda, who raised 2 beautiful, perfect children with her life partner, Don. And Glenda tried to give me advice over the years, and she certainly modeled the way to do it. We were living very different lives and learning from each other all along the way.
Oprah Winfrey, and I think if I had to pull out the quote in the entire book that I love the most, Oprah Winfrey, this is a quote from Oprah Winfrey. Pat paved the way. Pat paved the way, opening the door for what followed for me. You write Oprah's story is a testimonial to the power of one individual to change the world. Wow, so have you.
Oh, thank you, Tom. I was just going to say, so have you.
Well,
I mean, you have paved.
we probably would want to talk about that for an hour or two.
Yeah,
No.
you have paved the way for so many people. But can I give the background of that story so that it makes sense to people? Oprah and I started in the business almost at the same time. She was in Baltimore at the local station, and I was in Boston. And in those days, as I said, women were not encouraged to get to know each other or to support each other. So we would go to these conferences, and we'd, sort of, hi, how are you? And, kind of competing, comparing, the syndrome that continues, unfortunately, today in many cases. But and she lost her job, and there was a difficult time for her, and I really admired her. But we didn't cross paths again until 1984 when I was producing my own show, which I just talked about, Woman to Woman, which was the first show produced and owned by a woman-owned company. And Oprah was doing a local show in Chicago, and she was my lead-in. So we got to know each other again because she would promote my show. And I would, of course, visit and be a guest. And when I lost my financial backing, which is an interesting story in the book and one that is good for anybody interested
She
in.
recommends that every woman learn personal financial management.
Yeah,
And incidentally, it's offered in most universities. I hope it's offered at the University of Georgia in the business school, because I think that applies to men and women. All of us need to have at least, maybe not a degree, but we need to have a good course in our own personal financial management in it.
well, can I finish the story about Oprah?
I tried.
Well, I think we can get through the rest. But so Oprah was working at a local station, and they were able to take her show and move it right into the time slots in national syndication where Woman to Woman had been. And what the tough decision that I had to make, because I didn't understand enough about the financial management, not of our show, but of the company that owned us and sold us right out from under our own selves, without our realizing they had the power to do it. So there you go. Read your contracts really, really carefully. And then don't give up when somebody says, oh, you can't afford to keep that show on the air. Of course we could have kept it on the air. It was the #1 show. We just won the Emmy. But nobody told me I could do that. And I was looking for that kind of advice instead of trusting myself. This is one of the times I didn't trust my instincts. And I don't regret it because life went a very interesting way. I sold the concept to NBC and went back and did it for 5 years on the Today Show. But Oprah called me and said, you know, maybe I ought to think about taking my show national. And I said, you absolutely should. You and your following in Chicago, take that to the world. And the rest of that, of course, is history.
You and your producer were almost killed when a bomb exploded near you in El Salvador. You also took major risks in Israel, in Sarajevo, and elsewhere. One of your closest friends is Christiane Amanpour, who, as you mentioned earlier, is perhaps the most courageous war correspondent of this era. Why take such risk?
Well, probably the biggest risk was becoming a war correspondent at age 45, when most people were, you know, returning from except Christiane,
Yes.
who, of course, is continuing it and changing the definition of what's possible in so many ways. But there weren't any women covering, there were 2 actually out of all of the networks at that time. And I really was interested in the stories of women in those conflict zones you mentioned, who were on the front lines of the conflict, but who were finding ways to negotiate peace. And I wanted to know their stories, and NBC would not do the stories. They didn't think they were important. They said to me, if they're important, the guys will cover them. And they haven't, so they must not be important. So I quit my job at NBC and went to the Middle East and got the incredible privilege of watching Arab and Israeli women try and negotiate peace across the borders and the Intifada, which was happening then. And then in El Salvador, we really did find ourselves in some danger. But I don't like to emphasize that part because there are women, millions and millions of women living in danger every day in this world. And they're the ones that need to talk about danger, not me.
Ted Turner and Robert Redford have played major roles in your life.
Talk about danger.
Tell us about the 2 of them, starting with Ted, the real Ted that you know.
Well, the real Ted that I know is someone I so deeply admire and feel, like you, incredibly privileged to have worked for him when he was totally changing the media landscape in every way. I mean, what Tom and Ted did at CNN has changed our lives forever. We can't ever go back, and we need to go forward. I wish you were leading it now. And I wish Ted were leading our company. But working for him in those days was a little bit like a rocket trip ride at Disneyland. And that all you had to do was say, I have a good idea. He'd go, oh, let's create a new channel. Or I have an idea for a documentary series. Okay, tell me about it in 3 sentences. That's all you got with Ted. 3 sentences. And if you could convince him in 3 sentences that it was an important story, an untold story largely, an exclusive story, and one that mattered to the world, he would say, how much money do you need? Go do it, and do it right. So when we went to do the Cold War series, as you said, it was the most expensive series done to that point. 24 hours, 600 world leaders. It's still the most comprehensive history of the Cold War. No one else would have done that. Ted had this ability to see something no one else saw, and then no matter what people said to him, as you know, on the way up the mountain, he was going to the top. And if you worked for him, you had the decision, lead, follow, or get out of my way.
Tell them about being late with Ted.
Oh my gosh. The first week I was working for Ted, something I never thought I would do, by the way. I never thought I'd come back to the South. I'd lived, everywhere else, but here I was back in Atlanta, Georgia. Glenda was driving me to work in her son's, what was it? Some fancy sports car with a stick shift, which she didn't know how to drive. And so we blew out the gear shift on the way to work. My first day at CNN to meet with Ted. And we stopped at a Pink Pony strip joint.
Never been there, but I know where it is.
At 8 o'clock in the morning, well, actually, 7:45 in the morning, and I'm saying to Glenda, I'm going to be late. I'm going to be late. And she goes, oh, wait, here's a truck driver. She literally flags down a truck driver. I get in the cab of his truck, and he drives me to CNN. This was a really funny scene, especially as I'm trying to negotiate those steps in my high heels. But I run through CNN. I get on the elevator. I get to the 14th floor. Elevator door opens, and Ted practically hits me as he's coming on the elevator. You're late, he says, and you're fired.
Ted did not tolerate lateness. And we all learned that, probably most of us the hard way, but also be brief. He expected you to convey in the most condensed form the essence of what it was you were going to present.
That was a great lesson for me, and I now pass that on to everyone I ever work with. I'm learning that. But he didn't fire me, but he did say, when he got in the elevator with me, I said, Ted, it's 5 minutes after 8. He goes, my meetings start at 5 till. I said, well, you didn't tell me that. So he said, okay, you get one more chance. And then after that, I was there at 5 till. And by the way, when we see him, because we're co-grandparents, our oldest son is married to his oldest daughter, we all still show up 5 minutes early.
Robert Redford.
What an amazing man he is. I mean, we all know what a great actor and director and talent he is. But
you are the chairman of the Sundance Institute,
which Bob started 40 years ago, right at the height of his career, right after Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. He had enough money and enough fame, he could have done anything. He could have built a private reserve for his family. He could have had private planes. He could have had anything in the world he wanted. And what he wanted to do and did was make sure that artists all over the world who had a good story that nobody else was going to help them get made, especially not Hollywood, that he would set up these lab programs at this funky little ski resort he bought outside Park City, Utah, which he named Sundance. It was actually a sheep farm that had a small little pool. And he began to invite young filmmakers, directors, theater artists, people who had an idea or a story, but they weren't going to get support to get it done. And those labs still go on every month of the year, somewhere in the world, and thousands of stories and a lot of talented people that you now know came through those programs. It's not a film school, it's a lab program, and it works on mentoring, totally on mentorship with professional mentors from the industry.
Pat does not drop names, but I'm going to go through a list of them.
I think we just dropped two big ones.
I know.
Three.
Mikhail Gorbachev. And how did it come to be that Mikhail Gorbachev asked you to speak at his wife's funeral services, Relisa?
Well, so much of my life's great things, and especially the bold-faced names that I've gotten to know, I can track right back to Ted. So when Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union, or the Russian Republic at the time, he called Ted and he said, I want to do something else for the world. I want to save the world from the damage that the Cold War did environmentally. And I want to set up an environmental organization. And Ted said, well, I can't come to Moscow, but I'm going to send Pat. So I got to go and hear this vision for Green Cross International, which was and is a global movement to clean up the chemical and nuclear weapons that have polluted the earth and to create an environmental consciousness, which Gorbachev at 84 is still doing in Russia.
He really changed this world.
He really
and
did.
Gets so little recognition for it,
Yeah.
especially within his own country.
Well, when I got there to meet him, Tom, I couldn't find him. They said he has an office at the Kremlin. And literally, I walked through walls and offices, and it took us a half an hour to find somebody who could direct us to where he was. And he was in a tiny little, the size of a giant closet office. All of his papers confiscated and gone. Everything about glasnost and perestroika gone. And he was sitting there alone with his translator.
Pavel.
He nonetheless laid out this vision, and I called Ted and told Ted what it was. He said, I'll fund it. I'll fund it if you chair it. So I became the first chair of his U.S. board. Scott became the second chair and was a much better one, I have to say, much more qualified to do that. But in the process, we became friends with Reza and Gorbachev because we traveled the world doing environmental work together. And Reza was also greatly disliked in the Soviet Union.
She was
former
such a
Soviet
class
Union.
act in the way in which she dressed.
Well, that's why they didn't like her. She didn't look like, a babushka. I mean, they wanted her to look like all the other Russian women leaders, and she didn't. And she also was unbelievably outspoken. She would sit in the front row like this, and when President Gorbachev would be making a speech, she would go, time to stop.
Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
Give
yeah.
us Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
The story of Vladimir Putin.
Yeah. Oh, give me the story?
The story of Vladimir Putin.
I don't know what story you're talking about.
Ted meeting Vladimir Putin.
Oh, my gosh.
And-
that story.
Sure you remember.
Oh, I did. I didn't finish the funeral story.
No, but I was trying to...
Would anybody care or not? You'll read about it.
Go ahead.
You'll read about it. But okay, actually, it's a very short little thing in the book because I couldn't write about everything. I did fly to Moscow for the funeral, and here was a woman who was not liked or loved and was criticized constantly. But the Russians love you when you die. So the wake went on for 3 days, people coming to see the body and to celebrate her. And at the funeral site, there were very few people, however, and the Americans were represented by the U.S. ambassador, but there was Helmut Kohl, Margaret Thatcher, a lot of the world leaders. And I'm way, way back because I've got to go catch a plane, and I'm trying to find an escape route, and I hear my name. Gorbachev didn't speak English, but he said Pat Mitchell pretty clearly. And I go, oh my gosh, he's calling on me. And I had to go scrambling through the crowd up to the front and give remarks, which was an unbelievable privilege. But he wanted somebody to talk about how beloved she was outside of her country. Okay, so Vladimir. Vladimir invited Ted to go to his inauguration, his first. And so Scott and I flew over to Moscow with Ted, and we had an appointment that afternoon before the festivities of the weekend. And Ted walked in, and he was sitting way at the end of a very large stateroom. And Ted, in his loud, booming voice, says, "Vladimir, it's so good to see you. You were my driver in St. Petersburg."
And what happened?
Which he was, of course, because he was the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. Was that right, deputy mayor, or was he the mayor? He was head of the KGB, but nobody said that. That's true. But Ted took the Goodwill Games there in 1994, and that's when he did drive Ted around. He was his security person.
Real quick story.
But he didn't like the reference that we got disinvited.
Real
to
quick
the
story. Ted
inauguration.
lands in St. Petersburg. The mayor of St. Petersburg is to meet Ted, but something can happen. So he's met by this young official, and they get in the car and get a message to the car that the official's wife has been in an accident. Mm-hmm. And Ted has the car stopped and said, "Son, you take this car, you go to the hospital." And anyway, the official said, "Mr. Turner, I'm under orders to take you to your hotel and to dine with you." Ted says to him, and I quote from the person who was in the car, he said, "Son, you're under new orders now." So Vladimir Putin did take the other car, and his wife was actually in much worse shape. And until Ted screwed up in Moscow on this trip, Putin had a tremendous affection for Ted as a result of doing that. But apparently screaming out in terms of everybody in that room that night was not a good move. And Ted occasionally would have these spontaneous actions that we've all seen, which made us even love him more. But
I think we used to hold our breath when he began to talk in any public environment, and then we would all sort of exhale when he finished. But he was absolutely a fabulous person.
He said he had a group of Polish visitors in to CNN Center, and how this could occur to him at the time. He said, "Have any of you ever seen a Polish landmine sweeper?" And he did his foot like this. I mean, and you can imagine, of course, he was basically saying that the Poles use their own feet to find out where the landmines are. Well, you can imagine that made the press. We had other occasions. There was a cleanup detail occasionally behind Ted. All right, now this is friends, close friends. Tell us about Glenda.
Well, Glenda, I think our friendship is unique, but
Glenda's on the front row.
Stand up, Glenda.
Stand up, Glenda. Stand up, Glenda. She's married to a great football hero, incidentally.
That's right, a bulldog, yay. Glenda and I met here in our freshman year, and we had both pledged a sorority because both of us came from small towns, and we were worried about not knowing anyone here and felt that if we got lucky enough to get in a sorority, especially in those days when it was really much more important, I think, in some ways. You couldn't even run for class office unless you got nominated by a sorority or fraternity. It's hard to believe that was the case, but and we bonded right away based on our a lot of mutual experiences
Two of the most beautiful women on campus. I know that may sound sexist, but it's true. It's a fact.
Well, we'll accept it as truth and sexist. But we roomed together, and we've just stayed close friends across huge geographies. We had never lived in the same town, except in those, when we were here, and then for a couple of years in Atlanta, and then when I came back to work for Ted, this was 30-something years, I moved in with them. I lived in their guest house. I think Don's still trying to figure out how that happened. But it's because mutual respect and trust and living very different lives, completely different lives, but understanding and supporting each other's decisions and choices and being there for each other always. I mean, there was never any time that I couldn't call
Charlene Hunter-Gault.
But Charlene I met here in my freshman year as well, and she was such an inspiration to me. Oh my God, her courage, her serenity in the midst of what she went through, her constancy, her bravery just inspired me every day. I watched her with such admiration as she navigated being one of the two first African American students here. And then we lost touch after we got to know each other reasonably well, but we didn't see each other after college for a long time until we both ended up working. She was at CNN in Africa, and I was at CNN here. And I had already started to do a lot of work with the women in Africa in various projects, and a couple of them reunited me with Charlene. And then I became president of CNN, and she worked for NPR. So we ended up working together over a period of time, which was great.
Eve
and she
Ensler.
sends her greetings to you tonight, by the way.
Eve Ensler.
Eve I met in Sarajevo in 1994 because Christian couldn't go cover a story that was really important, and I got to go and do it. And Eve had just launched the V-Day movement, which is a movement to end violence against women and girls. She's the author of the Vagina Monologues, and that play has been performed every year, 5,000 times a year, by activists all over the country, has raised $200 million to fight violence against women by local activists on the ground. So I joined that movement, and it's been a really important part of my life. And
You said she taught
big
you
part
the
of the book.
importance of being in the room.
The importance of being proximate to a problem. We really can't understand or know how we can be part of the solving of a problem without witnessing and being close to it, I think. And Eve did teach me the importance of you have to be in the rooms where decisions are being made,
At the table.
at the table. And
Jane Fonda.
Oh my goodness, well, Jane's the best role model there is for being dangerous. In fact, when I declared myself dangerous that day, Jane stood up in the circle and said, well, I'm older than Pat, so that makes me a lot more dangerous. And she is. She's still out there protesting every Friday, has given up her life and moved to
Being arrested every Friday.
D.C., getting arrested every Friday
And
to
spent the night in jail lying on her coat.
to bring attention to the climate emergency. And this is Jane. Jane is someone that I know no matter what it is, whether it's a favor I'm asking her as a friend or it's a climate emergency. Jane is going to give 100%, and she's going to show up 100% of the time.
Glenn Close.
Well, Glenn's the one who got me to come to Sarajevo. We were on the Sundance board together, and we are good friends. And recently, she made a film in Atlanta, as practically everybody is these days. And she showed up at our front door, and she said, you know that house they rented for me? I don't like it very much. Can I come live with you? So she ended up living with me and Scott while she was making her film. She is quite a character and also a very brave woman.
Gloria Steinem.
We met in the 70s during the women's movement when Gloria had emerged as the leader, as she had every right to be. And we worked together. We did some amazing programs together, and we are still really good friends. And she and Jane and Robin Morgan founded the Women's Media Center, which I chair. So we work together very closely today, and we've still got a lot of things to
I
work
might
on.
just mention, president of Turner Documentaries worldwide, president of Public Television, PBS, president of the Paley Center for Media, member of the boards of Bank of America and AOL, co-founder of TED Women, chairman of the Sundance Institute, founder of the Women's Media Center. Pat, what's next?
Well, I hope a lot. I recently, in the epilogue to the book, the epilogue, I said I am never going to retire. I really think it's such a dangerous concept. And you can't be dangerous from the sidelines of life. We have absolutely got to be fully engaged. So I'm always ready for whatever's next. And I know you're ending this exactly on time because you
I
are
am.
such a good
I am.
CNN. You
I
are.
am. I am, but I have to ask you to
I
finish
want
your-
to read just one final poem.
Good.
But you asked me before I do that.
Yes,
Yeah, you
Yes.
go ahead and ask your question.
go ahead. All I was going to ask you is, you write that dating and dancing
Oh,
took priority over you going into the pulpit. Were you serious about becoming a minister?
no.
No? But you actually delivered sermons.
I did. I was serious about pleasing my parents. And that was something that really meant a lot to them. And I turned out to be pretty good at it. But everything I enjoyed, like dating and dancing, was a sin, according to the ministers.
It still
that
is.
Well, that depends on who you listen to. Okay, but I end the book with one of my favorite passages that I read the first time at a friend's memorial service. She had asked me to read it, and I wasn't familiar with it. And since then, I now have it on my desk so that I see it every day. So I'm going to share it with you as the beginning of the last part of the book. I am of the opinion that my life belongs to the community. And as long as I live, it is my privilege to do for it whatever I can. I want to be thoroughly used up when I die. For the harder I work, the more I live. Life is no brief candle to me. It is a sort of splendid torch, which I have got hold of for a moment. And I want to make it burn as brightly as possible before handing it off to future generations. George Bernard Shaw. Final sentence.
This is your marked up book. You have my marked
Final
up book.
book. Final sentence in the book. By sharing my story, speaking my truth, I am not passing the torch, but I am lending it here to light the way forward for others. Braver, bolder, I am dancing in its dangerous light. Join me. Thank you.
This is your book.
Thank you.
Before we conclude tonight, I want to make
Good night.
one other announcement about the way that Pat is helping to light the way forward. We've learned a lot about what it takes to, create a life like Pat's, to create a dangerous woman. But the way that's documented is through works like the book that you've written, but also the papers and the media and all of the things that have helped that you've created along the way and that others have about your life, your work, your career. And so I'm delighted tonight to announce to you that Pat has agreed to donate her papers, all the materials that document her life and work, to the University of Georgia, where they'll have a permanent home here in this building. Available for our students and the public to come in and to learn and again, to help to light that way forward for others. So we thank you deeply on behalf of the University of Georgia for your decision to do that. And Tom, thank you for leading and moderating tonight. And thanks all of you all for being here. And I hope you'll enjoy, there's an exhibit of some of the material from Pat's collection that is in the case just across the hall. So before you go, please take a moment to spend a little time with that, including your ID card from when you were a student at the University
I
of
know.
Georgia.
And some pictures that don't look like me but are.
I enjoyed one. I was looking at the collection earlier this evening, and I found a photograph of you, well, both of you with Fidel Castro, and I believe you had just come off the beach.
Yeah, that was actually not Glenda. Oh, you mean both of us?
Yes.
Right. Yeah, in our swimsuits.
Yes. So, at any rate, just as a little. Just as a little something to add a little interest for the collection. So thanks everyone. Good night, and thank you so much for being with us.